So Original Sinner is my newest series. My underlying principle as a writer is that if I'm not having fun writing it, I'm not writing it. I think I think writing is so much of a turbulent and sometimes very difficult career that to do it without having that sort of creative joy in it is very, very difficult. And so for me, I always have to keep my creative joy at the center of things when I'm creating an idea. And that's really what it was when I started to create Original Sinner, is I had been really into reading a lot of the romantasy books that were starting to come out at the beginning of this big romantasy trend. So I really liked the first person narratives of romantasy. I liked that there's the stories are a little bit more centered on the female characters, and there was more room in romantasy to kind of cross over from paranormal elements into different types of fantasy that had previously, when you were writing, when I was writing paranormal romance, was, oh, you can't do fae, you can't do, magic type stuff. It has to be specific paranormal creatures. So I liked that there was more sort of creative opportunity there. And I had been reading a lot of stories that were specifically Hades and Persephone retellings and really just loving those. And I was like, well, how do you take Hades and Persephone, right, and do it in a fresh way? Because at that point, the market was really being flooded with a lot of Hades Persephone stories. And so I liked that element of a kind of villainous outcast hero paired with a more innocent heroine, and I wanted to recreate that. And I was like, so well, how do you create Hades in a different way? And started just toying with that idea. And I'm like, well, you make him the devil, right? Like that, like you make him Lucifer. And so so that's where that idea came from. And then from there it just kind of, the idea spiraled out. So Original Sinner as a series, it's Lucifer and the other seven deadly sins are now these billionaire celebrities that are in control of a god abandoned New York. So God's nowhere to be found. The sins are in control now, and they're living it up in New York City. I
Oh,
love
wow.
visiting New York, so that helps. And my editor lived there for a long time. So having her perspective once I was in the edit phase was helpful. But I like visiting the city frequently, so it was a fun place to choose to set this. And thinking about how I was setting up the series in that way, the when I had the idea originally, I was like, well, he's going to live in LA, right? It's going to be Los Angeles. But at the time, my agent was like, no, you can't do that because there's this TV show called Lucifer where he lives in LA. And I was like, what do you mean? I hadn't even seen the show at that point. And so then I had to go watch the show to know what I was up against. And I was like, okay, well, it can't be in LA because this TV show's already done that. So where else am I going to set this? And I'm like, well, I love New York, and I'm wanting to make him this billionaire. So his Lucifer in the series, his company is modeled loosely after LVMH. So the idea is that he works in luxury because he's Pride, as the devil would. And so New York City just seemed like the perfect place to set that. I think there's a lot of room to put different balances of how much romance is included when it comes to romantasy as a subgenre. There's ones that are very heavy on the romance and others that tend to be lighter, but you still, if you're going to call it romantasy, you've still sort of got to meet those general tenets of the romance genre, which is there has to be a happily ever after, or at least a happy for now ending, either at the end of the book if the couple, if the story is ending in one book, or at the end of the series if we're talking about a multiple book series arc. So that's one element that writers have to consider. You have to because romance readers are going to throw it across the room if there's not a happily ever after at the end of that genre. But otherwise, I think that there's room to balance. But I would say most romantasies are at least 50-50 on the balance of like fantasy elements and romance elements, right? It's really different than a lot of high fantasy books or primarily fantasy books that just have a romantic subplot. The story of how these characters fall in love still really needs to be central to the book. And the way so I'm a professor in an MFA program and I teach romance writing. And so the way I explain it to my students is that if you can take out the romance and there's still a story, it's not romantasy. But if you need the romance for the story to continue, then maybe we're on the romantasy side of things. And I would say, as far as incorporating like some of the fantasy and like supernatural elements into the story, it's got to be present and like th throughout the story. This particular series, like Original Sinner, is somewhat interesting because the first book in the series, I will say, when you start to read it, it feels somewhat contemporary, other than the fact that the devil is a real person and he lives in New York City. But it starts out somewhat contemporary and feel like it feels like an office romance, right? He's the boss, she's his employee, right? And then things transpire from there and you get more and more of the supernatural and magic elements as the book goes on. And by book two, right, like it's totally, the world building's really exploded. But I think what potential writers of this genre have to know is that if you're going to include those fantasy elements, they really have to be hinted at the very least from the start of the book. Like they need to be present throughout. It can't just be a singular mention at the end and then call it romantasy.